Welcome to the Wire to Hunt podcast. This is Jake Hofer. On this week's show, we have Thomas Mlsna, who owns the Untamed Ambition, to talk about habitat projects you should be thinking about right now. Welcome back to another episode of Wire to Hunt. I'm your host, Jake Hofer, and today we're diving into a topic that I think a lot of deer hunters care about, but sometimes struggle to prioritize, and that's habitat projects that actually move the needle. There's no shortage of things you can do on a property: food plots, bedding cuts, hinge cutting, water holes, access improvements, tree planting. The list goes on. But the reality is not every project delivers the same impact. Some projects create real, measurable improvements in how deer use the property, and others sometimes just feels like busy work. Today, we're going to talk about what actually matters. Joining me is Thomas Mlsna from the Untamed Ambition. Thomas has a biology background and has been spending years working with landowners across the country, helping them design habitat systems that not only improve hunting, but improve the overall health of the landscape itself. And that's where this conversation gets very interesting, because when we talk about habitat improvement, we often focus on bigger deer or better opportunities. But the reality is that healthier landscapes can also mean healthier deer herds. In a time where hunters are increasingly concerned about diseases like EHD, the role that habitat quality plays in deer health is something worth paying attention to. So today we're going to break down what projects actually move the needle and how to do it, and why you should consider some of these projects for this upcoming season. Welcome to Wired Hunt, presented by Moultrie. Let's go ahead and get into this week's episode. Here we go. All right, Thomas, welcome to Wired to Hunt. How's it going?
Great. How are you?
I'm doing great. We have a lot of exciting things to talk about here today. It's spring. People are either relishing from a great season, or even if they are, they're probably identifying some different habitat projects that are going to help incrementally increase their success for next year and maybe even 5 or 10 years later. So, a lot of different things. There's a lot of different habitat conversations that focus on projects like that. We'll hit the high ones like hinge cutting, food plots, creating bedding areas. But in your experience, what are a few habitat changes that actually move the needle to improve your property? I understand this is completely situational, but on a high level of you consult for a living, you work on, your own place and all these different things. What is typically one of the biggest holes in the bucket that people need to get out the Flex Seal and slap it on a bucket and fix it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a kind of a loaded question. Every situation is so different, and the complexities of every individual landscape or every area are so different that it's hard to have, that cookie cutter or generalized answer to that response. What I would say, in every situation, our goal is always to analyze that objectively, highlight the strong points, highlight the weak points of every property, and then we prioritize that. What is that low hole in the bucket? When we are trying to build a property, we really focus on 3 main factors: holdability, huntability, and management efficiency. Our design element in and of itself is generally what creates the huntability side of things. The holdability is somewhat related to the design, but largely related to the habitat. And then the management efficiency is how effective you can improve and maintain that habitat along the way. So, we're talking about springtime, things are greening up. I was just in southern Iowa, which is drastically different from here in the Midwest. We're forecasted to get 8 inches of snow tomorrow. But I get down there and I almost have like a little bit of a panic attack where I'm like, oh, spring is here. Spring is here and we're not ready. And all these clients are waiting to, get ready to hit the ground running with spring. But every single individual client property has different low-hanging fruit, so to speak, or that one project that's going to give you the most ROI. When we go back to holdability specifically with habitat, the common denominator that I've seen on every property I've been on this year is availability of food. And, availability of food comes in a lot of different layers and levels. More often than not, we're always thinking like, what's the thing that we can plant? What's the magic bean or this food plot that we can plant? Which in some situations, that might be the low-hanging fruit. It's usually the easiest thing to address, which is largely why a lot of us gravitate towards that. That's pretty simple. There's a clear area there, or we'll push open this area, we'll plant this seed. It's going to solve our problems. But I think it's really important to emphasize and for the listeners to consider or remind them, because we're all aware of this at some level, right? But understand that when you look at the deer food pyramid, the cultivated food sources, and that's how I categorize them, food plots and even ag fields, those cultivated food sources make up less than 20% of a deer's diet. Actually, probably closer to 15 or 10% most of the year. So that's not the thing that's really going to move the needle for you. It's all the other food groups in there: soft mass production, hard mass production, native forbs and legumes, woody stems, bramble, stuff like that. Woody vines, I was going to say, bramble, and then your woody browse in general. And then at the foundation of that food pyramid is your mosses, fungus, and lichen, which are part of good habitat management, good forest stand management in general. And they kind of go hand in hand with the woody regeneration, which would bring me to, probably the top of the list in most situations, the project that's going to move the needle the most. If a guy has an afternoon or a day to get out and do something, it's going to be a timber stand improvement project of some sort. That's going to, I should back up. Your priority or your objective with any timber stand improvement project is going to be to get sunlight to the ground to promote regeneration. But it's not always as straightforward as that, which is why, it's important to have a good plan or really understand what that project entails as far as like what you do and the results that you should expect, which is going to be based on a lot of different parameters, right? Aspect of that piece of ground, that particular area. So let's back up. If I want to do a timber stand improvement project, and maybe I want to focus on an area that could be improved for bedding. So I'm moving the needle ahead by improving cover. I'm improving availability of food in a secure location, which is going to increase the holdability of the property, especially when you're talking about mature bucks that are more susceptible to pressure, right? So if I want to move the needle on that and I want to assess that specific location, I'm going in there and I'm looking at, first and foremost, the aspect of that location. Which direction does it face? Is it totally flat ground or is it a hill? How much sun is it going to get when I punch a hole in the canopy here? In hill country where I am, you get a south-facing slope, you don't have to cut nearly as heavy to get the same amount of sunlight in there. But at the same time, there's different levels to your TSI that will promote the best response. And ultimately, when we boil it down to management efficiency, we want to be thinking about this project, but then how do we maintain that or get ourselves in a routine that incrementally improves the property, whether it's this one specific area that we've improved or the whole property, painting with a more broad brush. But we don't want to fall into this trap of go cut a bunch of trees. Like you mentioned hinge cutting. You don't want to go like hinge cut a bedding area and then think that you're done, right? So like when I lay things out for the client as far as like priority projects, things that are going to move the needle, it's like, what can we do now? And how do we do that in a way that is a one-time time or money investment to push you forward? But ultimately, how do we manage that from that point on so that we don't go backwards? And that's what we see a lot on a lot of properties is, it's a project, we cut, we do this thing, maybe it's broad scale logging project, whatever it might be. But we go in, we create this disturbance, ultimately mechanical, maybe some chemical if we're cutting and treating and removing invasives. But how do we keep that in a state that is either constantly improving or at the very least maintaining so that it still offers that food value for deer, right?
What are some of those things for someone that's like, yeah, Thomas, of course, TSI, everyone says TSI is one of the most impactful projects. I did it 4 years ago and it seems like every year, the first 2 years it was really good and they were using it and there was a lot of browse and man, I found 2 sheds in there, 1 shed season. And now it just seems like activity and use is going down. So like, what are the things to address of whether undesirable species are coming back up or, like what are some of the things that you can diagnose to where you've already done it and you're year 4 into it? Like, I need to revisit this because you're saying the management of it is almost as important as the initiation.
I would argue it's more important for sure. And that's where I have multiple demographics, but 2 real main demographics of clientele. And both of them have the same problems, right? You have, and you're a realtor, so you understand this, right? The cost of land is not going down.
No.
The guys that can afford hunting land either are so busy with their career that they don't have time to put into it, or they're, ultimately it's the same thing, right? Either they're a prominent businessman that doesn't have a lot of time, or there's someone blue collar guy that works his tail off and either doesn't have a lot of time or doesn't have a lot of extra cash to jam into the property to hire someone to do these projects. Either way, I look at it the same way. It's like when we break these plans down into different projects based on a timeline, year one do this, year two do this, similar to like an equip contract, right? Where they're gonna be like, year one focus on this zone, year two focus on that zone, but then go back and follow up on zone one, right? And you get you in kind of this routine. But that's where equip kind of falls apart, because then it's just like, well, after 3 years and you're paid and you've removed the invasives, what do you do? So ultimately, prior to stepping into any of those projects, we need to be thinking, what are we going to do as far as a controlled disturbance to maintain some level of early succession in this area? And my approach, I try to get really, really detailed on properties. So we'll look at specific bedding locations, specific feeding locations, and various different types of food sources in general. And we're creating travel corridors and so on and so forth. But between those locations, we're trying to paint with a much broader brush so that we can manage at a more efficient level, because it's unrealistic to think that a client's going to go in and recut every bedding area on their property. Now, again, every situation's different. So if I'm a guy that has 15, 20, maybe even 40 acres.
You could do that.
And you can do that. Yeah, exactly. And that's fine. But I could argue that you could be a lot more efficient with your time having a management plan, right? And more productive as far as the regeneration and the response that you see from the seed bank and the current vegetation. So ultimately what it comes down to is, before you create any form of disturbance, you should be thinking 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the road, what is my follow-up response to that, to reset that area into early succession, which is going to promote a lot more food value, right? But ultimately, or in addition to that, would be to govern the response of the vegetation, or what you're going to allow to grow. So TSI, to really boil it down and simplify it, really for me, how I explain it to clients, TSI, the mindset you need to have with TSI is termination or regeneration of what's growing there. And then, am I bringing in some added diversity to that location, or am I just waiting for the natural native setting to respond appropriately? Which, again, this might get in the weeds a little bit more, but what we know more and more now, what we're learning more and more now, is a lot of these invasive battles, and it depends on the type of species, but a lot of these invasive battles are a result of soil at its core, the soil makeup, how soil has evolved over time from lack of management or previous management practices. For example, a property I just came from, old cattle pasture, right? So what happens when you have cattle on a pasture for a long period of time is they're relatively selective with what they graze, less selective with what they graze, but more selective with what they browse. So what happens to most cattle pastures ends up being a sea of eastern red cedars, multiflora rose, honeysuckle, locusts, yes, honey locusts, all those things that pop up that the cattle didn't want to eat. So when you start to decrease the species diversity or composition of vegetation on the property, the soil structure starts to change. In addition to that, you have cattle that are, conducive to ground compaction, especially if they're in a pasture under all types of conditions and they're not rotated. They're just kind of let to do whatever they want to do, right? So there's all these things at play. So if you go into a project and say, another thing that could move the needle quite a bit for someone, depending on their situation, if they have decent timber, or maybe the adjacent property just got logged, so there's some decent browse that's going to be taking place there. But maybe their property has more open area. They don't have a timber project that they can even do. So maybe that property, moving the needle there would be increasing the native forb production in open areas. But just going in and killing off cool season grasses, your seed bank response is likely not going to be desirable, because a lot of things are suppressed or have been killed off over time. And even just going in and throwing down seed, which is not cheap, perennial native seed is not cheap. Fantastic investment. Don't want to discourage anyone there. But just throwing that down and expecting it to do its thing, isn't always as straightforward either. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but it's a roll of a dice at a cost of $300 to $400 some odd dollars per acre for a diverse perennial forb mix, right? So when we look at that from that standpoint and kind of start with the foundation, again, we're looking at the soil type, we're looking at the soil moisture content, the current species compositions, how much sun it's going to get when we open up the canopy. And really, at the end of the day, it just all boils down to having that plan. Like, how do I get ahead of this? Whether it's timber stand or it's prairie, as simple a thing as like, before I go and plant this, what is going to be my next round of controlled disturbance? And if it's something like fire, which I would argue is the most
Yep.
exactly. So that's going to be the most efficient. Then it could be as simple as like, well, I don't want to start managing that area unless I know I have good access to it. So maybe I need to put a road system in first. And that might not require a bulldozer on site. It might just mean a weekend with a chainsaw and cutting a path where you can follow up a year later with a backpack leaf blower or drive a UTV through a certain area, to get access to the top of the hill or the back corner of the property, stuff like that. Access is going to be, we talk about this all the time, right? From a hunting perspective, access is so incredibly important. From a management perspective, I would argue it's even more important because if you're not accessing certain areas of your property, then you can't manage them, and not efficiently, right? If you're doing everything manually on the ground, hiking back and forth, doing all these things, like young strapping dudes like us can handle it, right? But then you hit that certain point in your life where you can't, or you don't have enough time. And if it takes an extra day or extra half a day to prep that, then that project won't fall into a weekend project list per se, right? So I kind of went down a tangent there, but I think you kind of understand where I'm going. There's no like straightforward, easy response or approach, but I think the biggest thing is thinking like, I want to do this thing, but what's the next step to maintain this thing? It's like I can go buy a nice chunk of land, but if I can't afford the taxes on it, how is that sustainable? Or if I buy my truck and never get the oil changed on it, like that's not sustainable either, right? So then your time investment, your monetary investment starts to decline, and then you look back and you're like, well, did that really move the needle? Now, on the other side of that, that's talking like long-term mindset, long-term planning, right? But if we back all the way up and go all the way back to the original question, like, what's that one thing I can do now that's going to move the needle for me this fall? Depending on your situation, maybe you have a property that has relatively poor habitat, but it's still holding deer because deer are a generalist species. They need food and cover. Food plus cover equals habitat. In a lot of situations right now, what we see is that this concept of habitat, right? Where you have cover here and food there, and that holds deer on the property. It's not a sustainable, long-term, resilient ecosystem by any means. But if we're talking right here, right now, what do I do to move the needle? Or maybe you're a person that doesn't have control over the property to begin with. Maybe you're permission based and you can do limited improvements, but you're not in a position to be putting together a 20-year management plan, right? And you have deer there. I think that the primary thing to consider is if you have deer currently, or probably not currently if it's poor habitat, because they're probably not there in February or March, right? But ultimately, if you have mature buck activity, or the quality of deer that you're willing to put your tag on activity on your property, right? Because everyone's goals are different. But if those deer are there, but you're not connecting with them, then it might be, as simple, to move the needle as like dropping some trees or hinging some trees to create a barrier. And that's where when it comes to management and hinge cutting specifically, I love hinging trees to manage or to manipulate movement, not necessarily to create food value. I don't want those trees to stay alive. I just want them to stay off the ground so they don't rot, to create a natural barrier that maintains for the next 10 plus years, right? And in time, that'll kind of fall apart too. But you can a lot of times condition deer to move through certain areas. So like an example I can think of, actually, if you dial back 2 years ago, I probably 4 years ago, I did a big timber stand improvement cut on an area of our farm. And it moved the needle for sure. We had a logger in, we took out some dead ash, we thinned some hickories, we released some oaks, turned into a nice bedding area. I hunted the fringe of that bedding area a couple of years after that, and we were already seeing pretty dramatic improvements. Dramatic increase in forage value in that location, increase in cover, it's holding deer. Pretty straightforward. But what happened is on stand, I had my target buck at 55 yards, couldn't get a shot, right? Okay, so if you're in that situation, and maybe you didn't do a prior improvement, but that's the situation. You've got an area that hunts well to a certain extent, but you have a lot of close calls, or you just can't cross paths with deer. They blow right through an area. That's where you can go in. And what I did ultimately was I created a mock scrape setup in one spot, and I felled some trees, some ironwood, some lower quality trees in a different area to force the deer movement around a certain, a barrier essentially, right? To force them around. So now all the movement flowing through there is within shot distance. Now when the deer are there, as long as I'm there at the right time, I'm set up for success. And that's a relatively quick project. So again, every situation is a little different. And when we analyze these properties, we want to look at it that way as like, what can we do to move the needle right now, knowing that there's an overhaul coming to this property, but an overhaul doesn't happen in one season, right? So how do we break that down? And then what are the low-hanging fruits? Is it adding a food plot? I was on a property yesterday, and there was multiple food plots throughout the property, and on their map, they had 2 previous consultants on the property, so they had good plans. And looking at the map, everything made sense. Oh, you've got all these food plots there. Like how? What do we need to change on the property? And then walking the property, it's very apparent the food plots themselves were not great. Like the condition of the plots was not. It wasn't anything that's going to be super, super attractive to the deer specifically. And we can talk about that in a minute or later on, right? But ultimately, the food plots weren't that great, and the surrounding habitat was terrible. So if you think that you're going to pull deer into your property with just a food plot, but you're not holding deer to begin with, then that's not going to move the needle for you. But if you're holding deer and you put a food plot in the right location and it's an attractive food source there, that can really move the needle, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not a long-term thing either, because every year you're looking at going back in and redoing that at some capacity or maintaining it at some capacity.
What's, for the end of March, first 2 weeks of April, what is the window of TSI, or what are time-sensitive projects that are like, man, if you're going to do this, and it's kind of somewhat of a blanket statement for, the Corn Belt, or or even you throw in Michigan, southern Minnesota, southern half of Wisconsin. What are what's the window of TSI? And the second question of that is, what are time-sensitive projects for the end of March to the first 2 weeks of April? Like, if you're going to do this, you need to get it done.
Well, this actually is not a great time to be doing some certain TSI projects. So I'd emphasize that if you have a property that doesn't have a lot of invasive pressure, then you can do just about anything. Cutting trees. When we go back to what I was saying earlier, this idea or decision you want to make as far as, I want to regenerate this specific species or terminate this specific species, right? Right now is a great time for regeneration. When you cut a hardwood deciduous species, when it's dormant, it's got the bulk of its energy load in the root system. So when you cut it, then it will regenerate with a lot more vigor when it comes out of dormancy. Inversely, right now, these trees are kind of starting to wake up a little, so sap's starting to flow. Guys are tapping maple syrup. Like I said, I was just down in Iowa. Things are already turning green. So on the other side of that, if I'm trying to terminate any given species, now is not a good time to do that, because if I try and cut and treat with a chemical and that vascular system is moving the energy or the sap from the roots up, it's going to push most of that herbicide out, and you're going to do a lot of work, and your efficacy is going to be dramatically lower. So it's kind of I don't want to say a wasted effort, but in many ways it can be, because you might think you're doing this thing that's, one and done, and it's certainly not. So this specific time of the year, I would avoid, and you'll know if you're cutting trees and there's sap pouring out of them when you cut, then it's definitely not a time to be cutting and treating anything. But if you're just trying to cut to create instant cover structure on the ground with that top, maybe feed the deer some buds right now late in the winter, and then set yourself up for hardwood regeneration or herbaceous growth that's going to come from getting the sunlight to the ground, now is definitely a good time to do that. That's what I would be focusing on more than anything. Right now we're what I'm personally doing across client properties, or what I have them doing is, we've done a lot of the bedding area cuts and stuff already. So we're kind of working our way back now, and we're finalizing and setting ourselves up for the food plot side of things, where we're feathering edges, improving the edge structure. Maybe we're prepping for tree plantings, where we're trying to peel back some of the non-desirables and plug in some, more specific attraction-based species in there. And then we'll segue into pulling soil samples, prepping for food plots, and so on and so forth.
A lot to it, man. There's a
There's
lot
a lot.
to
It
it.
never ends. And that's the thing. It's like, it's hard to be like, just go do this one thing. It's going to solve all your problems, right? It's just, that's just not the reality in most situations. Most properties have that one thing that can exponentially move the needle forward. But there's, like I said, with the complexities that are out there, it's not easy to say like, this is that one cookie cutter plan or idea that you should overlay on your property and expect to see the same results that that guy saw or that guy saw.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with that. And I've been on a bunch of different farms, and it's sometimes you can almost categorize farms to where, depending on, I mean, most of where I'm at is obviously Illinois, so it's like I can kind of categorize different farms here in Illinois. So let's run through a scenario for someone that they did not have a great season. You know, they had night pictures of bucks. They didn't find really many sheds. The sign was pretty lackluster, but you know, during peak rut, you had just enough hope and excitement to keep you out there. But it's like looking inversely, like, man, you know, something has to change if I want to increase my odds of success. So in that scenario, I'm picturing average to below average habitat. You know, the field, you know, like there's ag ground nearby, but you know, there's really not enough room to have a true destination food source. I mean, with something like that, is it an uphill battle that's worth hiking up the hill in that scenario? And hopefully that's enough context where you can picture a farm like that. I think realistically, more farms than not fall into that category if it's not strictly managed.
Yeah, 100%. I would go back to, now this is just operating under the assumption that someone has full control over their property, right? Not necessarily, like you said, maybe they don't have the space, or it does come down to the time and the budget, right? I talk about that food pyramid, and then directly related to that, I've got my time investment pyramid. Like, where should you be sticking your time on your property that's going to have the longest and the highest ROI, return on that investment? You know, when I have my discussion with clients, a lot of them, money is not the issue per se. It's the time, right? And even if they're willing to hire things out, it's like you can only get so much done in a year. So we want to look at all the different parameters there. But if you have control over the property, every situation is different. To be honest with you, I almost rarely promote destination style food plots on properties if there's ag in the area. The ROI on it just isn't there. It's just not.
So if you had let's run the, okay, so someone has, I'm gonna put, I did a podcast with Dr. Bronson Strickland, and like the break even on a big food plot, what he discovered, I want to say it was either 3 or 6 acres. I think it was 6 acres. So Thomas, I have 6 acres that I can do whatever the heck I want to do. You're not telling me to plant 6 acres of a corn and bean rotation and leave it for food. That's what you're getting at, because that's kind of contrarian.
Yes. And again, it's all relative.
Sure.
If there's ag in the area, okay.
Let me add a caveat. There is ag in the area, and you flip a coin whether they put anhydrous on it in November or if they work the field as soon as they pick it. Like sometimes they do it, sometimes they don't. So like you can't bank on that nearby ag.
Well, and here's where what I've boiled it down to. Okay. And my journey is obviously different from a lot of guys out there talking about this, right? I'm looking at things, I'm trying to look at things objectively in every situation and not just say, this worked here, let's do this here. And then ultimately, I'm looking at this from the long game perspective. Where has deer habitat come in the last 10 years, right? I think it's been a great thing in the industry in general, as far as like bringing a lot more awareness to improving habitat for deer. But I also think that we've gone off the path a long ways when we start to consider corn and beans as deer habitat, period.
Deer food.
It's deer food. Yes, it's deer food. But even the ROI on that and the cost of that, from a holistic standpoint, right? I'm a holistic land manager, and I say that in the sense that I emphasize and everything I do is based on managing systems and not individual species or individual plants. Where do deer fit into the system that they're a part of, right? Deer, they manage the vegetation on the landscape. They cycle nutrients through the landscape. So they are definitely part of the system. Where do hunters fit into that part of the system? We manage the deer and we manage the landscape, right? So we have to figure out this balance as far as like what problems are being caused upstream, what can we do to mitigate those, and how do we stop causing problems downstream, right?
So let's talk about where maybe we have gotten off track, and I'm giving you the opportunity to say like, hey, maybe we should think twice about this management practice or that management practice, or like everything you're saying is long term, right? And I think inherently, to a fault, deer hunters are 1 year minded. Next year.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
got any good bucks to hunt later this year? And like that's, that is to a fault deer hunters.
Well,
by and large.
and I yes, and I don't want to pretend like I'm like that much different from everybody else out there, right? I used to say that I used to remember my past based on the rock albums that were released by the artists I followed, like back through, people listening to this probably don't even know what CDs are anymore, right? But that I used to think about that, and now it's on the target buck that I pursued, right?
That's
I can think all the way
exactly
back.
how I remember what year it was.
Like my wife was like, "What year did we start dating?" I was like, "I 2008. I can tell you exactly when we started dating." Well, how do you remember that? Because I remember the deer that I didn't kill the day that I didn't go hunt to go meet you at college and go out to dinner. I was like, I remember that deer plain as day, right? So I'm in the same boat. And to back up on it, again, I think that our biggest issue, the biggest issue, is that we're trying to follow, and I don't want to like beat the food plot horse to death, right? But with food plots, and now it's kind of starting to extend into habitat management as a whole. We're trying to follow this mindset or this conventional management mindset and mirror conventional agriculture, right? And if you take a step back from that, there's nothing really great about how that's helped our country, how it's helped our environment, all these things, right? The only benefit from conventional agriculture is it's efficient in the sense that you put so much in, you get so much back out. But it's failing us as a society as a whole, right? We're not producing the healthiest foods. We've got the highest disease rates we've ever had as a country. Our healthcare costs are through the roof. And if we turn around, we take that same model and now we're employing it to farm for deer, or create deer food, where do we sit right now? We've got the sickest deer herds we've ever had in this country. In some areas, there's way less deer. In other areas, there's way too many deer. But we're setting ourselves up for this long-term failure because our ecosystem resiliency is at an all-time low because of the biodiversity. So to back up to the question, the conversation with Bronson, the food plot size and stuff like that, where I've shifted over the last 5 or 6 years is these bigger destination food plots. If we're planting a ton of food, a cultivated food source to feed deer, right out of the gate, our mindset is failing us. We shouldn't be cultivating an insane amount of food to feed deer per se. Now, having a supplemental food source post-rut, early winter, into the winter, I think is advantageous. Ultimately, I always refer to them as seasonally attractive food sources. So what can I plant there that's going to ensure that deer aren't leaving the property, especially during the hunting season, and ultimately pull them into the most huntable or accessible areas on the property so that I can keep pressure off of the more sensitive areas, right? I talk about this all the time with clients. Ultimately, when we're scouting a property, we're looking to create the most accessible pinch points possible. There's 2 types of pinch points that we look for or look to create. And ultimately, my goal is to always create some hybrid version of the 2. We have a physical resistance type pinch point, like I alluded to earlier. Maybe you're dropping some trees. Maybe it's a river crossing, a hole in the fence, topography, ravines, all these things that restrict deer movement on the landscape and choke deer down. If you go out and you try and engineer a spot like that, it can go against you if you try and choke deer down too tight. So the other side of that is an attraction-based pinch point. We're drawing deer in. It can be a food plot, it can be a water hole, some sort of limited resource. When we hybridize a pinch point, it can go from either angle, right? So we hybridize that. We want to choke deer movement down to a certain extent and then draw them in the rest of the way. It's like kind of trying to get your parents to change their mind on something. You have to kind of plant the seed and influence it, and ultimately it has to be their decision. If you try to get a mature buck to choke down into a small gap, he'll do it, but not very consistently. I've watched it many times where these deer get in these spots and they get nervous, they back out, maybe they go wide, and then you're out of the game. So if you can choke them down to a certain extent, draw them in the rest of the way, that's a beautiful thing. With food plots, we do this in many different ways, right? We can draw them into a big area, but maybe we feather the edges and create barriers, force them to enter in one end or certain areas. That makes that 3 or 4 acre food plot hunt like a quarter acre, a half acre, and then we know where to set up. But ultimately, the issue that I see more and more is this mindset of planting more food for deer that's annual food versus perennial food. So there's a concept we talk about frequently that is permanence, right? Like what's something you can put down that's going to be more permanent on the landscape? Now, nothing's truly permanent, right? Because everything's evolving and changing, but what's something that's going to last more, a perennial type system? So what I've done a lot the last couple of years and all the designs I draw up now, we've shrunk down these 6 acre food plots and stacked our food plot, created a system to stack our food in one area that ultimately has a lower footprint, a smaller footprint. So instead of planting 4 acres of food, because let's be realistic, most of those big destination food plots have to be 4 acres because the browse pressure is so high on them that if you want to get 1 or 2 acres of standing beans to last through the hunting season, you have to start out with 4 acres. Okay. Mm-hmm. So what is the cost of that? Management efficiency. What is the cost of that? I can tell you the exact cost of that. $350 to $450 per acre, probably on average for beans when you start talking about seed cost, fertilizer costs, chemical costs, right?
Yeah.
Corn's even worse, $400 to $700 per acre.
Probably.
Right?
I mean, depending, you could probably make an argument that's $700, $800, or $900 depending on the chemicals and treatments and fertilizer, and corn's a pretty hungry crop.
And to anyone listening that's planted corn the last 2 years and like, that didn't cost me that much, just wait. Just wait.
That's because what I'm getting at with the fertilizer.
Corn pulls a lot of stuff out of the soil and doesn't put a whole lot back in the soil, right? And that's a whole other thing too. Like, so let's actually talk about the cost of a food plot like that. On average, depending on your planting practices, but on average, corn and beans are responsible for about 2 to 10 tons per acre of topsoil loss on an annual basis, just by trying to force a monoculture that doesn't protect the soil between the rows. You lose a lot to wind erosion, you lose a lot to water erosion. Where does that end up, right? That ends up silting in these ponds that are catching runoff. On top of that, the chemicals that go into that, where do those end up, right? Those end up in those ponds. They end up in the groundwater. Now, take this whole nother level. What happens to those ponds, right? Anyone who's listening that's dealing with or terrified of the next year ahead with potential EHD outbreaks, maybe took a huge hit last year. Hopefully the deer that survived are immune to it now and didn't just avoid getting bitten, period, right? Because you don't want 2-3 years of that in a row, right? 1 year sometimes is actually probably a blessing in disguise to help kind of reset things, as much as it hurts. But ultimately, where is that coming from, right? What's the problem, the root cause of that when you look at the landscape? And I can argue, again, objectively analyzing these landscapes, being on many properties that had EHD issues and seeing the weak links in all these properties, it comes down to biodiversity. So as simple a thing, and to go all the way back to the food plots and where my mindset is and the strategies I employ, and this is the same thing that we use to combat EHD, to combat CWD, to combat whatever the next nasty disease is. In the South, I've got Southern clients that were bracing for impact with the New World screwworm. If you've read anything on that, right? This is a potential issue coming down the pipe too. Mm-mm. Fly lays an egg in an open wound, and basically that worm eats that deer alive. So there's things like that out there. It's moving through the cattle industry and whatnot. But anyways, the way that we combat that is by increasing native plant diversity on the landscape. TSI projects a lot of times can be overwhelming for people and harder to manage. And I think that's where most people should be looking to move the needle. But if you do, and this is kind of our approach, if you take that 6 acre destination food plot and shrink it down to a super efficient 2 acre system, and then you take the remaining 4 acres and plant that to the Hoxie native seed, native perennial food plot mix, right? Just throwing that out there, a native food plot or native
what are some of the
mix.
So like for someone that's like, what is that? Why would I, take up precious food plot acres for something that doesn't look really awesome, like from the drone or it's like the deer are just going to be selectively browsing in there, where it's like most times probably don't even know what they're really eating because there's so many different things popping up. So what's in that is truly attractive enough for someone to give up acreage.
Well, and that's the beauty of it, right? So we go back to habitat. Food plus cover equals habitat. The beauty of native habitat, hardwood regeneration, native forbs, is there's a huge amount of food value in there. The timing of the year isn't the same as a food plot, right? That's why I say food plots are seasonally attractive food sources. The food, we'll use the native forbs, for example, right? So pollinator planting, flowering forbs. Like if you just whittle it down, like if it's a wildflower and it flowers, it's a weed that flowers, that is most likely a forb or a legume. Those, from a deer perspective, directly to the deer, offer a ton of food value, specifically during the growing season. So to start out, you have a perennial plant with a significantly deeper root system that has evolved over the last 400 million years plus, right? To supply those animals with the right amount of nutrients that they need, deep root system, mining minerals, the fiber ratio in there with the protein, all these things are perfect for those deer. And that might be one bite of that plant today and not for a week, right? But when you have a lot of diversity, 30, 40, 50 different species growing in any one given area, those deer are in there every day throughout the growing season. And the reason I bring up that native food plot mix from Hoxie is because there was a lot of thought put into that to engineer that to get the most desirable, most palatable deer species in there. And that starts to lose its attractiveness and food value going into like mid-October timeframe, which sets you up perfectly to pull deer into your food plots because they become more attractive. But at the same time, it still maintains a level of cover. So what we do on most of our properties now is we're shrinking down our food plots and we're filling that void on the outside with perennial food sources like that. So we're conditioning deer to flow in those areas, providing a lot of, it's basically like creating a big feathered edge or buffered edge in these areas as it transitions in, and adding shrubs in there. If we want to create better lines of movement, we plant rows of shrubs, stuff like that.
How tall does that mix get?
Most of the time, and again, it's going to be dependent on the conditions, right?
Yeah.
The soil type and whatnot. But
Like
most of the time, what
2
we
to
see,
4 feet?
there's much taller than that.
Really?
I would say, there's species in there. Well, it's a wide variety. So you're going to have shorter statured species like some of your like prairie clovers and stuff like that are only going to get a foot or two tall. But then you're going to work your way up to like goldenrods and asters and stuff like that are going to be 3 to 4 feet tall. And then you're going to get up, there's some grasses in there, some extra structure and some cover.
I think there's Indian grass in it, I think.
Yep. But ultimately you're going to get, there's things in there that are 5-6 feet tall, depending on how established they are in the soil type. And why I love it is because from a deer perspective, like the best deer cover out there, especially in a transition zone, is eye level high on a deer. They can stand in it, they can feed, they feel safe and comfortable. And then you take a hunter and you put them at an elevated position. Even, like if I have a box blind set up near a food plot like that, I like to keep them relatively low, 5, 6, 8 feet off the ground, not too high. But now you're looking down into that so you can see everything. But the deer feel super secure and safe in there, right? But from a deer perspective, directly feeding on it, huge advantage. But that's not the point I'm trying to make here with this whole system and the true cost of it, right? So we go back to the disease mitigation and managing a system as a whole. When we increase the vegetation or the diversity of plant species on the property, we increase the diversity of insect species on a property, okay? When we do that, it's the same thing for deer. If we only plant food plots that are attractive in the fall, then we shouldn't expect to have deer on the property all year long, right? So if we increase our food, look at that whole total food pyramid, have a lot of food sources, we condition deer to stay on the property year round, or at least the bulk of the year. Maybe they're coming and going, but they're always anchored to that spot. The same thing goes when we look at insect diversity. If we have a lot of insects on the property, now we're anchoring and holding insectivores on the property. So our predatory insect population, like dragonflies and predatory wasps, increases exponentially. Our bird population increases exponentially. Our bat population increases exponentially. Why is that important? Because when midsummer rolls around and the biting midge that spreads EHD works its way up from the south and creeps further and further north, bites a few deer, lays some eggs in the mud, waits for that next hatch. When that hatch takes place, if we have these predatory animals, these insectivores on the landscape, they clean up a hatch really quickly. And maybe you lose 1 or 2 deer, but these flies aren't running rampant,
It's
biting.
not 80, 90% mortality,
Correct.
like which some
then
areas experience.
Yes, and then they go lay these eggs in the mud again, and the next cycle is even worse, right? So instead, there's like one round, and mostly it's gone. And we were talking about this earlier, like on properties that have really good biodiversity, we don't have EHD issues, plain and simple. And it's a snowballing effect because, the sediment, topsoil that ends up in these ponds, that's part of the problem. The chemicals that end up in these ponds, the chemicals we put on the landscape, they all affect other things. There's a lot of collateral damage with them. Now, I'm not entirely anti-chemical, right? It's just like, what moves the needle? If we're just putting a lot of time and money and thinking that a 2 or 4 or 6 acre bean or cornfield is going to change the game for us, we're setting ourselves up for failure. And I can take that to a whole nother level on that too, because if we're creating these plots like that, specifically a standing grain that is super attractive in the wintertime, right? What we're doing is we're pulling deer and increasing the concentration of deer on the landscape during the time of year where conditions are at their worst. The resources are at their lowest point in the season. So it's easy from a deer manager standpoint to be like, this is awesome, right? And there's consultants out there that talk like this. You want a big food plot because you want to pull deer in from all around late in the season. Well, if you're in an area that has CWD, do you want a high concentration of deer on your property during the winter? And I'm sure there's people out there right now rolling their eyes. Well, CWD is not a real thing.
You said the 3 letters.
Yes. And now I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who has dead deer on their farm every year from CWD. Okay. So I think it's also important to understand, like, if there's people out there that are trying to poo-poo the threat of CWD, if they're not directly dealing with it in their scenario or on a client property, then they shouldn't be talking about it. Plain and simple. That's my perspective, right? Now, I'm not in the mindset of the sky is falling, right? I don't do anything any differently, to be honest with you, for CWD. We still need really good habitat management. Why? Because it keeps deer spread out and keeps them healthy. It's the diversity of the diet, the diversity of the nutrition that they receive throughout the whole year and the consistency of it that's going to keep them healthy. With that habitat comes the balance in that system. So we're mitigating things, not just the EHD spreading, biting midges, but things that increase pressure on deer. Mosquitoes, biting flies, ticks, all of these things cause problems for deer that can all be mitigated by increasing the biodiversity and having more predators on the landscape that consume these pests and these parasites. I was kind of drew a blank. These parasitic animals, right? But ultimately, with CWD in general, like keeping those deer spread out is a big part of it. But that's not even the whole issue that I've been seeing more and more and more across properties. So again, sorry, we've been going on a tangent here, but you back all the way up and like if your goal is to improve your property for the long term, and this is always my goal with clients, is what can we do that's going to be incrementally improving the property without this like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or more so 1 step forward, 2 steps back is what we're seeing more often than not. These big standing grain, attractive late season food sources, what they do is they pull in a lot of deer. So that in and of itself is a problem. But something like corn, when you look at it from a nutritional standpoint, is not very good deer food. It's a very fast burning carbohydrate. Deer ferment everything in their system, right? So it burns fast, but it's no different than people. So if we go eat a ton of carbs or a ton of sugary stuff, do you ever feel full or you just want to eat more and you want to eat more, right? Like you go out to eat dinner and you go to and specifically in America because of our grains and how they're grown, right? You go out and like eat a bunch of pizza, you wake up the next morning, you feel like garbage, but you're just hungry again. You just want to eat more and more and more. You're never satiated. You have to have protein in your diet to feel satiation. And deer are the same way. So if they go out and they eat a bunch of corn, you're pulling all these deer in. Now you've got all these deer from miles around that have pulled in. And what are they doing when they go to bed down during the daytime? They're just mowing down on your native habitat and setting you back. I mean, this property that I was just on, when you want to highlight or emphasize the weak link on the property, of the food sources that we grade properties on, we look at cultivated food sources, we look at soft mass production, hard mass production, native forbs and browse, or native forbs and legumes, bramble and woody vines, and woody browse. And then at the base of that is mosses, lichens, and fungus. Okay. When we grade all that and we explain it to the client, we're looking for those low points, bottom hole in the bucket. This property I was on yesterday, I brought the client over and it was explaining the browse issue. But it can be deceiving because if you don't understand the species you're dealing with, it looks like there should be browse and it should be covered because there was plenty of brush in a lot of areas in the property. But it was almost 100% Japanese barberry, multiflora rose, and northern prickly ash, which is not an invasive, but shows up with lack of fire, lack of management. On this property, the deer were eating, like, if I had to guess, feet worth of the canes off of the multiflora rose. I mean, there were spots where multiflora rose was browsed down to about a foot off the ground and the stem was like a dime size. And the same with the bush hunt, or the northern prickly ash. I was just like, if deer are eating this, that's a problem. Mm-hmm. Like, that's a big problem, right? So it kind of explains that, to move the needle. So ultimately,
that's a good spot check for people that maybe the next time they're going out to their farm, look for the browse line and look for what they're browsing. And if you see a row of cedars on the edge of the field and they're off heavy, you're like, okay, well, this is something that needs to get addressed.
Yeah, 100%. But it's a snowballing effect. And that's why, like, I don't, my job, at least the way I explain it to clients, right, is like, we're going to take this thing, we kind of started this out, or we alluded to it many times. Like, there's a lot here to talk about, right? So let's take this thing that's super complex.
And intimidating for people who
intimidating.
Yes. This is all new to them right now.
Well, and instead of trying to dumb it down to be like, and this is something that we were talking about earlier, and I've heard it many times from different consultants, different foresters, like, well, it's not worth the battle fighting these invasives. You're never going to get ahead of them. And that's just blatantly false. It's blatantly false. If you have a good management plan, starting with the physical setup, the physical structure and components of a property, access included, vegetation included, right? Starting there and working your way up, it's very, very doable. It's very, very doable. And if we ignore it in its entirety and just say, let's simplify this, just focus on a food plot, that thick cover that's being produced from those invasives is advantageous to us because it holds deer. It really does, right? Any form of cover next to any type of food will hold deer. I mean, you can drive through, I've got a client up in Duluth, Minnesota. You drive through Duluth, Minnesota on any given day, and there's bucks bedded down behind wood panel fences in people's backyards, and they're feeding on bird feeders and introduced alien shrubs in their yard. Is that good deer habitat? Right? Not really. It holds deer. Point being is we don't want to oversimplify things to the point where it's just like cookie cutter, buy this, do that. We want to take this complex thing and boil it down. And I do think at the end of the day, it's pretty simplistic. It's just like focus on native diversity. And then the species types, basically the amount of structure and cover that you're going to produce in any given area of your landscape is going to be based on the species and the disturbance intervals, or the return interval of the disturbance, right? So the more frequently you disturb it with good management, I say that because you can disturb and everything can turn into grass, right? But the more frequently you disturb, generally speaking, the more food value that location is going to potentially have. So like food plots fit right in that same equation. If I'm doing an annual food plot, I'm in there once a year, maybe twice a year, doing a couple things for that. It provides pretty good food value, but it's very narrow in that timeline versus like a timber stand improvement where maybe we go in and reset with fire. Maybe you can't run fire through there, so you do have to do some chainsaw or bring a mulcher in, brush hog it off during certain times of the year. That, something we do every 3 to 5, 8 years. It just depends on the growing conditions. But that resets things, gets back to early succession, and that's how we kind of govern the amount of structure versus food. But ultimately, we want native habitat because it provides food and cover together, which is truly what habitat is at the end of the day.
One question, then we'll go to quick rapid fire here. More of a request than a question. Give these folks right now a sense of words of encouragement of like, because when the people hear this, like, so you're telling me I have to do more than just do my fall food plot to really be a true advocate for the landscape, and to your point, like the farms that have really good habitat, they typically seem to be more resilient to EHD than the ones that have been degraded. So give a word of encouragement. This effort is worthwhile because for a lot of people, they're going to have to go down a wormhole and start learning a lot of different skill sets, which I like. I get excited about that. What do you say to them?
Well, there's an evolution of a hunter, right? We've probably talked about it before. I know for sure Mark has talked about it on this podcast, right? There's hunters go through this evolution where, they're just trying to get close to a deer and they're trying to kill a deer and they're trying to kill a specific deer. But ultimately, as land managers, we go through this evolution. I see this with my own clients. You get to a point where the bulk of the enjoyment comes from working the land at some level or some capacity, right? And that can be a small thing. And that's where food plots don't generally move the needle, but I understand it. It's kind of a gateway drug into land management, right?
Definitely is.
Yeah, because it's like you do this thing, and if things go right and you have a good plan or a decent understanding, and that's where I would argue like having a better understanding allows you to be more flexible and adjust your plan versus just like this cookie cutter chain of events that we follow and pray for rain and hope it works, right? But ultimately, if you're in this and you're enjoying it, you start to get to this mindset where you're trying to build something that's truly long-term. And I ask my clients straight up every time, like, is this a long-term legacy type property? Or is this, maybe it is a lease property, or is this just like a here and now, I want to make the most of it the next 5 seasons. Maybe it's just a land investment. I'm going to flip it. I don't want to put a lot of time and money into it. And I totally understand that too. But I think the biggest thing for people to think about or to focus on is this concept of permanence or perennial systems. Like, what can I invest my time and money in right now that's going to move the needle for me? Maybe it doesn't move it a ton this year, but maybe after a couple of years of implementation and initial management, so like the native food plot blend, for example. So let's prep for that. Let's plant it. The first year we keep it mowed, knees to ankles, knee high, mow it down to ankle height. That reduces annual weed pressure, stuff like that. The next year we don't do anything. And by year 3, it's like alive and rocking, right? So once we get that set up, then it's just, every few years we touch it either with fire or mow it. And we have a system there that's feeding and improving the resiliency and the quality of our whole system, but it doesn't take any more time or money after that. So that's finally at a point where like we've done this thing here. Now we can move away from it. Yes, we have to revisit it, right? We always have to maintain, but it's moved the needle incrementally forward in a way that's not just like, well, we got to do it all over again next year and all over again next year. So I really, back to the food plot thing, I really emphasize with guys like building perennial systems to where, maybe something happens, business, family, not enough time, not enough money. You could walk away from that for a year and it's not going to change the dynamic of how your property hunts, period.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of my clients right now are in our generation. A lot of them are popping out babies left and right. They're starting businesses, changing businesses. They're doing all these things. And it's like the conversation I had with the client yesterday is like, this is awesome. Like everything that you're telling me makes so much sense at this point. And they're a little bit disheartened from the fact that they wasted 10 years from these other consulting plans that were just like a list of projects. Do these projects, you'll see the needle move. But ultimately, he said it straight up. He's like, what we need to figure out is who's going to do the work and how are we going to pay for it, right? And that's a whole nother level of it too. And we can go down that rabbit hole. I mean, a big thing I do with these properties is we're looking for ways to create more cash flow on it outside of, again, like a project-based income, like a logging project, or even the limited cash flow that comes from renting out cropland, right? And you're a great advocate and educator on like the EQIP and CRP programs. And that's the other beautiful thing of, and not to give them too much credit,
Yeah.
but that perennial native food plot blend from Hoxie falls into a pollinator planting for CRP. So if you're a guy that has row crop land that you want to improve habitat, you can get paid per acre to plant a perennial food plot for your deer. And it's a beautiful thing when you can pull that off, right?
General Continuous is open right now. So this is good timing.
Yes, get in there. But ultimately it comes down to like thinking about, there's the short-term things, there's long-term things. Put this water hole in, do this thing, like how do you maintain it moving forward? But the mindset shift that comes with thinking long-term, as far as like, where can I invest my time and my money now that's going to set me up or more so maybe even set my children up for success, right? And I think that's the big thing that we're overlooking more and more and more now is, we're just focused on how do we kill a deer this season. But if any of us take a step back and objectively analyze the current state of affairs, things are not getting better. They're not getting better, right? They are in the sense that I do think that there is a mindset shift happening in the industry, pushing more on habitat beyond just food plots, stuff like that. But where it stands right now, the conventional practices that are being pushed and preached and promoted by some of the biggest voices in the industry have not been setting us up for success. And if you take a step back and look at those objectively and go, is that guy's mindset based on permanence or product sales? And that's where we fall into this trap. And myself included, I sell food plot seed to my clients for a living. Not necessarily for a living, it's a supplemental income.
Sure.
But I'll be the first one to tell you, we should cut your food plots in half and pay for this one-time expense that you can set yourself up for that's going to increase the resiliency of your property across the board. And there's a lot of it there. And there's a lot of opportunity out there. But the mindset, to go all the way back, the mindset of invasives are here, they're not going anywhere, we just have to deal with them, is complete BS. Another example of that is reed canary grass is another good one. For a long time, the conventional thinking there, even within NRCS and some of these government agencies, was you can't get ahead of reed canary grass. It just is what it is, right? So anyone that has a wetland area that has reed canary, that provides a decent amount of cover during part of the year, and then most of the year it just lays out flat and zero food value, right? So we're actually working with Hoxie on creating some wetland mixes. But why I bring this up is I want to just tell people, first and foremost, there is a very effective approach to mitigating reed canary grass. And secondly, when you look at ecosystems and their potential productivity, we rank things on a parameter referred to as net primary productivity. How much dry matter or forage production is produced with any specific habitat type. And when you look at different habitat types and what is the most efficient or the most productive, water is the number one nutrient there. So the wetter the habitat type, the higher the net primary productivity. So when you have a wetland area on your property, to just, especially, and I'm thinking of this because I have a call coming up here in an hour with a client that 50% of their property is a wetland area, all reed canary grass. And
is there trees, is there maples, cottonwoods, basswood trees, or is it just
around some of the edges?
Okay, but other than that, it's like a mat of reed canary right now.
And almost completely flat. Mm-hmm. The other 50% of the property rolls into this really cool, ungulated topography with some little peaks and ridges and stuff like that. So it sets up really well. It's you got food. You could have a lot of food in the swamp and a lot of bedding up here, and even add bedding structure and stuff in that swampy area. It's not like a true wetland. It's more seasonally wet, right?
Sure.
It's wet enough that it's choked out a lot of stuff, but reed canary has thrived, is what it is. But something like that, from a productivity standpoint, has the potential to not only increase dramatic amount of biodiversity on the property, which creates resiliency, but ultimately feed your deer an insane amount. So you don't need to have 5 acres of alfalfa on your property to feed the same tonnage to those deer. And at the same time, it keeps them all spread out throughout the whole year, not concentrated around those only food sources on the property.
Real quick, for someone that has reed canary, what is the, as fast as possible, I want to be respectful of your time, what's the quickest way to get rid of it?
Again,
or the way to do it?
You got to be thinking management. So first and foremost, you got to, if you can burn, if you can't burn, you got to figure out a way to create burn break around the perimeter of what you're trying to burn. And what I would tell people, and this, is another big thing that I preach, is the more you can cooperate with your neighbors, the better off it is. Because sometimes it's a ton of time and money to create a burn break across the middle of a swamp if the property line is there. But if you talk to your neighbor and say, hey, can we just access on this and maybe we do a collab and we do this together, right? So that's one side of it. But ultimately, timeline there, you want to be thinking is you want to burn, in the springtime or late summer, but you want to burn off the thatch layer, and then a fall treatment of herbicide is critical.
Like clethodim?
Either cleth or even just gly. And I tend to lean on glyphosate a lot more. Glyphosate's been in the news a lot negatively, but it is the lesser of all the evils. I will tell you that right now. All of those herbicides have downstream effects or soil residual effects, glyphosate is the least of our problems. It just becomes more problematic with repetitive use, right? So like food plot wise, we try and peel off the chemicals as much as possible once we get food plots established. Different topic of conversation. But in the fall specifically, it's important because when those plants are starting to go dormant, and reed canary grass has a very rhizomous root system. It's, essentially creates like a turf barrier, very similar to turf grass, but like insane. And another mistake I see guys make is like, well, I worked up that area when it was dry. Don't do that. Every time you bust those roots in half, you just multiply that. You cut that worm in half and it regenerates into 2 worms, right? So you don't want to approach it from that standpoint. You want a fall treatment of herbicide, and that's why I like Gly. It's cheaper, it's equally or more effective in general, but it's the timing of it. And you want to hit any cool season grass in general. If you can hit it after a cold stretch in the fall, when it's still warm, warms back up and it's still actively growing with a foliar herbicide like that. The big thing is in the fall, it's going to grab that herbicide and it's going to draw it down in the root system. And usually in 1 year, a lot of times 2 years, you can wipe out most or all that reed canary by doing that. If you try and burn it and spray it right away in the spring, it's hit or miss because it's pushing a lot of energy up and it's actively growing and it's a lot harder to kill. So that's the protocol that we follow. And now with drone sprayers and stuff like that, it's a lot easier to get that done. Your conditions, and also with Gly, you can get Wetland approved Gly, which has different type of surfactant built into it. But ultimately, you can use the herbicide at the most effective time and not be limited by the ground conditions per se, or even like the pressure it puts on your property. Instead of zigging and zagging out there with an ATV or bigger equipment, or God forbid you have to do it with a backpack sprayer and that volume, gosh. Right? It'd be terrible. A drone guy can do it super efficiently, in and out and on with it. But the key thing there is you got to reduce the thatch layer so you get better contact with the herbicide, and then a fall treatment of the herbicide is a really good way. And if you get into the part, I usually would give it at least a full year to make sure. Once you get to that last fall treatment, then you can go right in there a lot of times and broadcast in that perennial blend, and it's got the whole winter to cold stratify, and it'll get a big boost the next year. So that's our operating procedure in there. And again, there's a lot of layers to it depending on site conditions and individual landowner goals and such. But that's very effective.
Okay, real quick, rapid fire. Most underrated habitat tool in your arsenal?
Most underrated habitat tool in your arsenal. I mean, obviously, it's easy to say a chainsaw or a drip torch, right? Mm-hmm. But I think we talk about those a lot now, and people are starting to catch on to it. Yeah, I mean, again, it kind of starts with that foundation. Sometimes the most underrated habitat tool is just a plan, plain and simple.
That's fair.
You know what I mean? Because again, like we don't want to be thinking like project, and setting yourself up for success. The burning thing always comes up, and I have this conversation with every single client. Are you willing to burn? Do you want to learn about burning? Some guys have done it; they're all for it. Some guys are apprehensive. Some guys are completely against it for various reasons. Usually, they've had a traumatic experience. I had a client that had a house burned down.
Oh my gosh!
He's just like, I don't even want to think about running fire through here. And I always try and ease their mind. I'm like, I'm not saying this to brag. I just want to give you something to relate to. I did all of my personal burns last year with my 4-year-old daughter and my 8-year-old son. They were the only staff I had, right? And
cheap,
I say that
cheap labor,
very, very, very cheap. Not super effective. They're mostly spotters, right? I park my daughter on one corner, safest spot she can be in. You watch that fire line. If that fire gets across it, you yell for dad. Son can go on the other side. He's a little bigger, can make better decisions. Give him a shovel, electric leaf blower. If it hits the fire line, put it out. If you can't get it out, get out of there, yell for dad. Pretty straightforward. But ultimately, what it all comes down to is having a really good plan laid out.
Yeah.
We've got a good plan. I know the timeline there. I've got I could also say like, an underrated habitat tool would be a bulldozer, right? If we cut in burn breaks, or a mulcher, cutting in a burn break, or a skid steer, chainsaw, all that falls into their backpack leaf blower, creating access points and burn breaks, something that's easy to maintain where oh, the conditions look right today. I throw on the leaf blower, go out, zip a perimeter around that. I'm ready to burn, and not like this ongoing thing where it's like, well, all this prep that comes, with that. But ultimately, having the plan laid out, and it's no different than how we hunt, right? It's like if I'm a guy that only has like that 1 week out of the year that I can hunt my property, and I have to really be dialed in, I'm looking for a very specific set of conditions to go into some of those really, really productive spots. And if I hunt them at the wrong time, it can cause problems for the whole property, right? The same thing goes with a burn plan or any plan. It's like if I have everything laid out in front of me where I understand the timing that's going to promote the best response, then I'm just sitting back and waiting for the conditions to be right, and I can jump and go do it right now. Maybe I've got an hour at the end of the day, zip up there, relatively easy, right? And you need more than an hour to burn most of the time. Not the burn itself, but the mop up afterwards, right? But even that, it's like, oh, we've got the right conditions today and rain's coming tomorrow. I'm burning. And I'm going to watch it a little bit, and I'm going to sleep a lot better knowing that rain's hitting, at the wee hours of the morning to suppress everything else. But yeah, again, drip torch is great. Chainsaw, is probably going to move the needle for more people more than anything else. But that's short term if you don't have a long term plan. So I would argue, and we could whittle it down to having a plan, a good plan. And I'm not saying that from the viewpoint of like you need to hire me, but you should write things out on a piece of paper. Take your map, lay it out, look at every individual area of your property and go, okay, what do I want this to be? And what's it going to take to get there? And then what's it going to take to keep it there? Or how do I reset it? Because, again, painting with a broad brush, there's going to be properties where, maybe all they're doing is managing via timber harvest. Okay, well then don't harvest the entire 100 acres in 1 or 2 years. Stagger it, break it up a whole bunch in a mosaic so they're in there every 5 years and you have a rotation in there, right? Mm-hmm. And again, you got to stay ahead of the invasives. That's a big problem that we see on these properties where they just go in and cut heavy and there's no management plan, because then you don't get any good regeneration. And then you're talking a lot more cost per acre to get ahead of it down the road when you decide that or come to the realization that it's a problem, essentially.
Yeah. Most overrated habitat practice, and then that's it.
Most overrated habitat practice, I don't want to jump on this bandwagon, but I would definitely say hinge cutting is right up there.
Why is that?
Well, and again, I don't want to generalize too much. I definitely employ hinge cutting and utilize hinge cutting and promote hinge cutting to a certain extent. But when you're hinge cutting, I think it's important that you want to look at hinge cutting. And again, what is this going to turn into years down the road? A successful hinge is very problematic down the road in the sense that it's hard to manage. It's 100% manual reset of that hinge. So if you're a guy with a small property or even a big property and you have like a handful of very specific hinge cut areas, bedding areas, screens, however you create those, then you just have to have that on your reoccurring schedule of every X number of years, I'm going in there and I'm recutting that, right? Versus going in and flush cutting or cutting, like pollard cutting at different heights and stuff like that to encourage regeneration at certain levels. That can be managed a lot more easily, either resetting with fire or just going in and cutting, like one fell swoop, whatever it might be. Where hinge cutting, I think, is the most effective and how I utilize it the most is that, back to what you're talking about, creating barriers or obstacles in some sense. When I hinge cut to create a barrier, I don't want the tree to stay alive. So I'll cut it as far the way through as I can to keep it hanging on. And sometimes I'll even hinge cut it and I'll girdle it below the hinge, or usually girdle it first and then hinge it so it's easier to get access to. But ultimately, I just want to keep that tree off the ground because I want a barrier there that doesn't rot away in 3 to 5 years. And also keeping it off the ground creates a little bit better barrier also, right? But if I keep it off the ground, out of the moisture, less bacteria, less bugs there, it lasts a lot longer. I'm creating structure that lasts a long time. So if I go in a bedding area, I might hinge 1 or 2 trees in there, but I'm not doing it to keep them alive. I just want instant back cover. And I'm understanding that in time, it's going to fade. It's not going to be a permanent solution. But I would definitely argue hinge cuttings, it falls right in those parameters of a project that creates more work for you down the road. And I've been on so many properties where there's these nasty hinge cut messes that, basically it becomes a tree with way too many stems to try and manage again. And then around it is filled in with invasives and it's hard to access those spots and it becomes a tangly mess. And then the mature bucks just don't like them as much. the does will tuck in there, the bucks will bed on the backside of it, but they don't generally get into it. And I say this, again, people are listening to this and be like, wow, that's bullshit, BS. I've seen that on my property and it worked. Every area is different, right? It's all relative to the area. But as far as things that I think are way overblown or way overdone are like massive hinge cut projects for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, Thomas, if someone's fired up and wants to learn more, maybe wants to get a plan, where is the best place to get a hold of you? And anything else you want to plug here?
Yeah, well, hopefully I didn't just confuse everyone or turn their...
There's some confusion, I'm sure, but hopefully it sparks curiosity.
Yeah. Well, you can reach out to me. Instagram is probably social media where I'm the most active. The Untamed Ambition. My website's probably the best place. If you're serious and you want to plan or you want to have a detailed conversation, the best thing is just go to my website and schedule a free call. That's awesome. It, theuntamedambition.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.